Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. This week I'm going to be bringing you an album by an artist named Avery R. Young called Tubman. Now, like a lot of other African-American artists that I've encountered in this last year or so, Avery R. Young is kind of an interdisciplinary artist. He cites himself mainly as a poet, but he's also a visual artist and clearly a musician. And also a kind of a Black studies specialist. He's a voice in the community. He's an activist in the community. And I got kind of hip to Tubman last year, early on in the year, like January, February, that time of the year. And at first I was very attracted to it simply because the very first kind of track that I heard from it, the sample track, really kind of took me back to a classic 70s funk styles. It felt like I was listening to an old Stevie Wonder record or maybe old Funkadelic, that era of kind of Black and African American music. And my interest in that aspect of the album definitely paid off. I mean, that's the foundation, I think, for the whole album is that kind of classic idea of funk rock. But as I got into the album and started listening to it more, there's an aspect of it that really also drew my attention even further, and that's this vocal aspect. There's a very strong presence on Tubman of kind of gospel choir styles. It almost felt like I was listening to a Black Queen album. I don't mean like Black Queen, but I mean like, what if the band Queen was Black? And if the band Queen was Black, they had a very strong choral component in their music. It would sound a lot like some of the things that are happening on Tubman. And superficially, again, this is a part of the album that really drew me in and made me think about, like, there's something bigger going on with this album than it just being your regular funk rock album. My first impression of Tubman was that it was almost like a history lesson in very important Black music styles. And the time that I've had with the album since then has not really diminished that opinion. As a matter of fact, I still feel really strongly that there's a really great example of like non-hip-hop Black music in this album, a cross-section of this. But this style of music that he's creating here, he calls it, as a word for Seuss funk. And this sort of blend that he has of gospel music and 70s, aggressive 70s funk styles has a broader meaning than just the superficial presence of these styles. Especially if you start talking about the choir. The presence of the choir, I think, points to a really strong background that Avery R. Young has in the church, and which is not unusual. The Black church, the African American church, is a really important part of the culture. The spirituals are the root of the whole thing. And of course, spirituals branched off into a couple of different styles. One of them ended up being the blues, and the other one ended up actually going into the church. And the African American church ended up being, as it evolved, being a place in which a lot of African American culture was reified and performed. So the church played a really important role in developing what we now see as Black culture. Now, let me give you a caveat on this, because here's where it starts getting problematic. As a white guy, I feel a little weird about talking about African American history without admitting that I'm speaking as an outsider of that culture. And I'm only talking about it to enrich understanding of this album, because I think it's a brilliant album, and I want to advocate for it. And a part of my advocacy of this album is to show the way that it reflects the brilliance of Black culture, the ways in which it reaches back and pulls on these threads to create something that's fresh and new and relevant in current contemporary Black culture, and for us, as maybe even non-Black listeners, how we can enjoy it in a deeper way. And as you start to delve deeper into Tubman, it becomes apparent that his attachment to the church and as a lens for looking at Black culture goes way beyond just the presence of gospel choir backgrounds on the album. There's a really moving track in this album that is called "Lead in the Water," and I think I got to point out too that Avery Young's lyrics are all written sort of with deference to some colloquial standards in Black speech. So he will write things that look kind of like they sound, but then also put more proper spellings in parentheses to show that he's not just, there's a reason why he's doing it. So this spiritual, Lead in the Water, is for the people of Flint, Michigan. And it's a repurposed spiritual. It's based on an old African-American spiritual that he kind of rewrote for that context.
In the water, children, let land in the water. Charlie playing God with water.
But his use of the spiritual there, I think, is an indicator of the sense of resistance that Black culture has kind of embedded in it. And in this regard, it's important to note that the album's name is Tubman, and that's a reference to Harriet Tubman, of course. And there's an important statement that he has in the liner notes of this album where he talks about, refers to Tubman, something to the effect of, Tubman didn't run to freedom. She ran because she was already free. And I think there's an implied reference to her sense of resistance that is a focusing lens on this album as well. And the closing track on this album, Tubman itself, has, I think, the line that sort of is kind of the key to the whole thing. One of the things I think about this album that he's trying to make as part of his message is to talk a little bit about blackness. And blackness is a problematic term, and of course it's one that as a white person I can't comment too much on as an outsider of Black culture. But what I can say from what I've read and from what I understand is that even within the culture of the African American culture, blackness is kind of a slippery slope. You know, what is black, what isn't black, and what's the sliding scale on how much blackness is something. Well, he claims very clearly in this song that he's black. There's nothing black, no one blacker than him. And he's not even referring to himself in the terms of Tubman, I think, Harriet Tubman. But also, that message, that statement, I think, is how he's throwing an idea about what blackness is over this album. For him to talk about drinking red Kool-Aid is a celebration of Black culture and the amazing things that Black culture has, despite the resistance that they've had to maintain throughout history. But it's that resistance that's allowed the culture to be so strong and so well defined. And this album, I think, overall is a celebration of that. And I think the album throughout, top to bottom, is extremely great. Musically, it's very brilliant. There's a couple of songs towards the end where we don't have as much of a structure as some of the other songs, but there's definitely a pride in what Avery R. Young is exuding on this album that's palpable, that comes through. And it's as a person who appreciates the music as an outsider, I think it's an amazing message to look at and try to gain a better understanding for where he's coming from and how he's trying to represent his culture as a Black man, as an African American in contemporary culture. And this is an album that I think, for me, has been daunting to cover because I have a whole lot of respect for it, and I have a lot of respect for Avery R. Young, and I love it. And since I've gotten it, I've tried to be more sensitive about how I address Black culture and Black music, because I think you can't talk about Black music without talking about Black culture. And so I really appreciate the opportunity that Avery R. Young has given me to listen to this album and dig deeper into what he's doing and to try to get a better understanding of where he's coming from as a Black man in our current society. I'd also like to point out that Tubman is a soundtrack to a book that accompanies it called Neckbone. And Neckbone is a collection of, it's a poetry book if you hear Avery Young talk about it, but it's as much a poetry book as it is kind of also a collection of visual art pieces with writings and words and stuff on them. And very often there are themes that are pulled from that book that are also referred to on this album. I think the Neckbone book is particularly interesting to see as almost like a think tank, a brainstorming session for the themes that he used on Tubman. So an interesting companion piece for sure, not necessary to understand the album, but definitely will deepen your understanding of Tubman to look at Neckbone if you're curious. But that's all I got on Tubman this week. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe and share it out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I'll put another Tubman track up on for this year's playlist. And I'll catch you guys next week. Till then, see you on the flip side.